There's been more data leaks recently in the video game world, some leading to troubling concerns over the future of the AAA gaming industry itself. These leaks include an early build of the new Wolverine game being out on the internet, data breaches in personnel files and information, reports on budgets and where Sony is at as a company in general for the time being. I do feel sorry for the victims of the breach having their personal information doxed by these hackers. However, what I want to focus on is the imminent demise of the AAA space with just what we know about these numbers from the data leaks. I came across this video about the differences in the Final Fantasy VII's Remake's graphical updates, and it just seemed like a perfect time to reflect on this.
We're going to take a look at the recently released Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade and see how it stacks up to the initial release of the game from last year. For this analysis, the latest release is being played on a PlayStation 5 console, and will be set primarily to its graphics mode, allowing for a dynamic resolution that targets a native 4K output. Whereas the previous release is being played on a PlayStation 4 Pro, that also features a dynamic resolution, only with a maximum output of around 1620p instead. It's also important to note that the PS5 version does offer a new performance preset that lowers the target resolution slightly to allow for a buttery smooth 60 FPS, something that I'm sure many users, especially those not yet running on a 4K panel, will appreciate. And what's even better is that if you already purchased this game for PlayStation 4, whether it was digitally or physically, then you can now install the PS5 version completely free. However, bear in mind that the new expansion pack featuring Yuffie is a separate paid expansion, and you are not entitled to the PS5 upgrade through the PS Plus version of the game.
So a theory that's been making its rounds on Twitter is that the future of video games will be games chopped up into pieces being sold at $50 a pop. Let's keep it a bean. This is already where we are with the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's no surprise to anyone at this point that the industry is nickel and diming its consumers to offset the cost of these bloated video game production costs. What I want to point out here is that listen carefully to what he's saying. If you already bought this game for $60, they let you have the graphical update for free. But if you want the character DLC expansion, you have to buy it. The expansion is $20. So that's $80 for a game that is not even complete. The remake is barely the first 20 hours of the original Final Fantasy VII. If you're buying this new, as they expect you to, that's $80. Keep in mind, the original Final Fantasy VII was $50 and it was a complete game.
Let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at some character models and the texture work applied to them, starting with the lead protagonist, Cloud. Now, disregarding the obvious bump to the max resolution, Cloud himself hasn't really had his model changed all too much.
It looks like they just improved textures and lighting, maybe some glitches. It is just a performance update if anything. What I want to add to this conversation as well, and I'm sorry I do go off on a little bit of a rant here, but what I want to add to this is that this remake is currently being sold in different parts, and it's confusing me, but let me go over what I found. You have the original base remake. Then they released the intermission is the side character Yuffie DLC. Now they released the Remake Intergrade, which is an enhanced version of the remake. And the next part of the game that is coming out is Rebirth. I just checked and that is retailing for $70 for the base game, $100 for the special version. Okay, so altogether, you buy the original Final Fantasy Remake for $60, buy the intermission DLC for $20, then when Rebirth comes out, it's a whopping $70. That is $150, and that is barely half of the game. It's not even the full game. There is still another separate part of the game being developed. By the end of this all, Sony or Square, or whomever honestly, fully expect you, the consumer, to pay probably well over $200 for this one game. Do you see the problem here? And this isn't even including the eventual re-release where all the parts are together on one disc for full price. For this, I'm not really even thinking about the people who wait till the holidays for games to go down in price, or the people who buy it secondhand. Final Fantasy VII Remake did gross $7 million in its initial release, so I believe a lot of people still buy games brand new on release days. Honestly, if you can wait it out a couple of months to a year, you can buy these video games for a fraction of the cost. I'm telling you all now, the original game is on almost every digital gaming platform and is going for like less than $10 and it's the complete experience. Now back to the graphics talk.
The poly count is the same, All the animation work tied to the model is identical, and even the number of visible hair fibers coming from his head seem to match up exactly. However, there are still some very slight improvements that Square incorporated that are easy to miss, and the results, while seemingly minor, really show during the many cinematic cutscenes throughout the game.
All interesting talk here, honestly, but let's skip ahead a little bit.
Moving on, we have the environment. This was an area that I feel was in desperate need of improvement with the latest release, as there were a number of problems with the PS4 release of the game, mainly pertaining to the LOD and texture streaming. The world itself is beautifully detailed, with large draw distances, tons of NPCs, and some really striking imagery, all paying homage to the original classic. But the illusion quickly falls apart whenever these details are observed up close, with really low-resolution texture work and low-poly assets. However, sometimes these details appear this way simply because the console fails to load the proper high-res textures when up close, something that's most noticeable when in the more heavily populated areas like this city market, or the main Sector 7 slums.
This has to be said. This game retails for $60. It is unfinished, buggy, and has graphical errors in it. To be fair, nearly every game released in current year requires day one patches. That is, unfortunately, very standard in this industry. By unfinished, what I mean is that this is only one part of a three-part game. The original Final Fantasy VII, believe it or not, was on 3 separate discs, and they actually sold it all together. If it came out now, each disc would be sold for $60 separately. I say that as a joke, but that is exactly what they are doing.
I found numerous details throughout the game that weirdly look like they're still loading some low-quality placeholder asset for some reason. Many textures look flat and muddy, and while rare, there are still a few instances where textures will pop in on screen. Another major issue I had with the initial remake release was the weirdly designed skyboxes. The skybox itself also feels noticeably distinct from the actual rendered environments, appearing like a low-res image file and ruining the effect. Though, with the latest PS5 release, that problem has been rectified a little bit, as most of the skyboxes have been redesigned with more detail, and the volumetric lighting effects do help to blend them into the game world more naturally.
In retrospect, I don't know why I decided to add a conversation about bloated AAA budgets onto a video that's talking about gaming spec comparisons.
Next up, we have lighting. This is an area that has received a surprising amount of changes. The light design has been tweaked in practically every scene, with a large increase to the density of volumetric lighting, greatly altering the look and feel of several key scenes.
Not by much if we're being transparent. It looks a little foggier, but the intention is still there.
This opening sequence, for example, where Cloud jumps off the train and we're given that heroic reveal.
I just need to stop and point out here that Cloud is the hero of the game by all intents and purposes. But in the opening cinematic for Final Fantasy VII, you are hijacking a train and blowing up a reactor.
And while it looks cool at first, it does also hide some of that nice specular lighting and texture detail that we had before. And most of the time, the changes that were made to the lighting do benefit the artistic presentation. And while it's difficult to tell for sure due to its variable nature, I failed to notice any actual increase to the particle density, something that I feel the original release already did a perfectly fine job with. Moving on, let's talk about some of the new features that have been added with this updated version of the game. Now, I mentioned before that you can swap to a new 60 FPS mode with the PS5 release, which by itself is reason enough to replay the game again. But they also finally added in the long-requested photo mode with this release.
I'll never understand people's need to take photos in video games. Then again, I don't care about game specs or resolutions or the dreaded 4K.
Finally, there's the biggest new feature, the paid expansion pack starring Yuffie. This brand new story campaign isn't very big, and will take you only about 4 hours to play through. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. I personally didn't notice much of a difference here.
5 minutes later.
Get down here, Merc.
I wanted to talk about this scene because how did Cloud even hear Barrett tell him to get down? He was on the other side of the train.
Overall, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade is a modest improvement to the 2020 remake. It certainly looks better in pretty much every area, but some of the more blaring visual issues like the design of the skybox and the many low-quality environmental props are still present here, and some of the latest visual enhancements like the increased volumetric lighting sometimes drown out details that looked fine before. So while yes, the graphics do experience a net gain overall, I think the biggest reason to double dip here if you're a PS5 owner is the additional Yuffie expansion.
Okay, so overall consensus is buy the game again cause it includes the DLC. Keep in mind, I need to stop saying that phrase, but if you did originally buy the game, then decide to based on this recommendation buy Intergrade, it's $70. That would make this a total of $130 for just basically the first disc of Final Fantasy VII. If you bought both the Remake and Intergrade for full price, I believe Intergrade may be on sale now. I'm not entirely sure. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a good place to start for this conversation, and I'm speaking primarily here of the AAA sphere. Nintendo seems to be doing their own thing and is just fine. It is beyond absurd what they're doing. I need to reiterate this point again because I feel like I cannot stress this enough. Final Fantasy VII Remake is only the first part of the whole actual game. It is being sold for full retail price. The PS1 game originally was $50 for 3 discs. Now, you can blame inflation, but each quote disc end quote is being sold for basically $70. I'm bad at math, but that's quite the markup. Let's pivot back to the leak I originally opened the video with. Let's look in better detail at Spider-Man 2 and its numbers. The budget for Spider-Man 2, thanks to the leak, was $135 million. It sold 7 million units and we know it didn't break even. This model is not sustainable. We're seeing in real time why the prices for the PlayStation Store are increasing, why the price of gaming is increasing. They're trying to make up for lost profit with the production of these games. The Ratchet & Clank game suffered $8 million in losses as selling 2 million copies wasn't enough to recoup its $81 million budget. I have to ask, why are the budgets for these games so big? Maybe the reason Nintendo doesn't keep up with hardware is so that they can make games people can enjoy with modestly scaled back budgets. Years ago, if you would have asked me, I would have said no one can touch Sony. But now Nintendo seems to be leagues ahead of all these other publishers. They still have their scummy practices, but they know what the fuck they're doing. Final Fantasy VII Remake is an egregious example. But this is what the future of gaming looks like to these companies accompanied with live services and microtransactions galore. It's here. Either these companies scale these productions back a little, which they have no intention of doing, or it'll collapse sooner rather than later. Only time will tell.
Also, if you haven't tried out Final Fantasy VII Remake at all yet, and are looking for something to play on your PS5, now's the perfect time to finally jump in and give it a try.
I'm going to save this topic for another day, but I think the original game is worth playing more than the remake. Aside from the obvious fact that it's substantially cheaper to play, and is in fact the whole game, I think the story resonates better and isn't just fan service of beloved characters. The original Final Fantasy VII is great for reasons that current corporations could never understand. That's it for me today. Just wanted to share some thoughts. Thanks.